Methamphetamine did not begin as a street drug, but as a laboratory chemical. First synthesized in 1893 by Japanese chemist Nagai Nagayoshi while researching derivatives of ephedrine, a compound extracted from the ephedra plant used in traditional medicine for centuries. In 1919, another Japanese scientist, Akira Ogata, refined the process into a crystallized, smokable form, unknowingly laying the foundation for what would later become one of the most destructive substances in human history. During the early 20th century, methamphetamine was viewed as a scientific breakthrough rather than a threat, praised for its ability to increase alertness, reduce fatigue, suppress appetite, and improve focus, leading to its use in medical treatments for asthma, nasal congestion, depression, and weight loss. Pharmaceutical companies in Europe and Asia began producing methamphetamine legally, marketing it as a harmless stimulant at a time when drug regulation was minimal and public understanding of addiction was almost non-existent. No one yet understood how deeply meth altered dopamine systems in the brain, nor how powerfully it rewired reward circuits, creating dependence far stronger than cocaine or heroin. What began as chemistry and curiosity would soon be weaponized by governments, normalized by medicine, and eventually unleashed upon societies unprepared for its consequences, marking the first chapter in a global crisis that would span more than a century. During the 1930s and World War II, methamphetamine transitioned from a medical stimulant into a military tool, most notably in Nazi Germany, where it was mass-produced under the brand name Pervitin and distributed widely to soldiers to enhance endurance, alertness, confidence, and aggression. Beginning in 1938, the German military issued millions of Pervitin tablets to Wehrmacht troops, tank operators, pilots, and infantry units, using the drug to support long marches, sleepless combat operations, and rapid invasions such as the 1939 invasion of Poland and the 1940 Blitzkrieg across Western Europe. Military doctors initially praised methamphetamine as a miracle drug that reduced fear, hunger, and exhaustion, but reports soon emerged of severe crashes, hallucinations, paranoia, heart failure, and violent behavior among soldiers after prolonged use. Adolf Hitler himself was later administered stimulant injections by his personal physician, Dr. Theodor Morel, contributing to erratic behavior and declining health in the final years of the war. Germany was not alone. Japan supplied methamphetamine to soldiers and factory workers, while Allied forces, including the United States and Britain, issued amphetamines to pilots and troops under different names to maintain combat readiness. By the end of World War II, in 1945, millions of soldiers returned home already dependent on stimulants, flooding civilian populations with leftover supplies and normalized use, transforming methamphetamine from a controlled military aid into a widespread post-war problem and setting the stage for its explosive spread into civilian society. After World War II ended in 1945, methamphetamine rapidly shifted from military stimulant to civilian medicine, as pharmaceutical companies repackaged it for everyday use, prescribing it legally for conditions such as depression, obesity, narcolepsy, attention disorders, and chronic fatigue, while surplus military stockpiles leaked into black markets across Europe, Japan, and the United States. During the late 1940s and 1950s, methamphetamine was sold over the counter in many countries in tablet and inhaler form, marketed as safe, modern, and non-addictive, especially appealing to housewife students, truck drivers, and factory workers seeking energy and weight control. In Japan, post-war meth abuse exploded under the name Hiropan, leading to one of the world's first meth epidemics by the early 1950s. Forcing the government to ban the drug in 1951 after addiction, psychosis, and violent crime surged nationwide. In the United States, pharmaceutical brands promoted amphetamines aggressively, and doctors prescribed them with little oversight, unaware or dismissive their addictive potential. Early warning signs such as hallucinations, paranoia, insomnia, and dependency were often misdiagnosed as mental illness rather than drug-induced damage. This era cemented methamphetamine's transition from a controlled substance into a socially accepted stimulant, embedding it into daily life and medical culture, while governments failed to regulate its use, unknowingly nurturing a dependency crisis that would resurface decades later in far more potent and destructive forms. By the 1950s and 1960s, the United States entered an era where amphetamines and methamphetamine became deeply woven into everyday American life. Fueled by economic growth, long working hours, and a cultural obsession with productivity, thinness, and success, pharmaceutical companies marketed stimulant pills aggressively to doctors, prescribed them freely to office workers, students, athletes, and especially women, promoting them as solutions for weight loss, mood improvement, and energy, while diet pills containing amphetamines became common in beauty and fashion culture. Truck drivers, factory laborers, and night shift workers relied on stimulants to stay awake for extended periods, unknowingly developing physical dependence and psychological addiction. At the same time, early signs of widespread abuse began appearing, including increased hospitalizations for psychosis, violent outbursts, insomnia, and heart complications. But these warnings were largely ignored or minimized. The counterculture movement of the 1960s further normalized drug experimentation. And while attention focused on psychedelics like LSD and marijuana, stimulant abuse quietly expanded under the radar. By the late 1960s, growing evidence of addiction and social harm finally forced the U.S. government to acknowledge the crisis, leading to tighter regulations and the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. It's classified methamphetamine as a Schedule II drug, marking the end of its legal mainstream status, but not the end of its influence, as restrictions only pushed production and distribution into illegal underground networks that would soon reshape the drug's identity forever. As the legal supply of methamphetamine tightened in the late 1960s and early 1970s, the drug found a new home within America's growing counterculture and underground communities, where it became known by street names like Speed and was embraced for its ability to heighten energy, confidence, sexual desire, and focus. Motorcycle gangs, outlaw groups, and fringe subcultures adopted meth as both a recreational drug and a source of income, distributing it at concerts, truck stops, and rural gatherings, while users often believed it was safer than heroin or cocaine because it did not cause immediate overdoses. During this period, meth use spread heavily among blue-collar workers, bikers, and long-haul drivers, embedding itself into communities already isolated from mainstream economic opportunities. The drug's psychological grip became increasingly evident as chronic users experienced paranoia, aggression, insomnia, and hallucinations, yet continued using to avoid the intense crashes and depression that followed withdrawal. Law enforcement struggled to respond because meth production was decentralized, occurring in small illegal labs that were easy to hide and difficult to track, especially in rural areas. This era marked a turning point where methamphetamine fully transitioned from a regulated pharmaceutical into an illicit street drug, creating a culture of addiction and criminal networks that would soon evolve into far more powerful and organized operations, setting the stage for the rise of crystal meth and the devastating epidemics that followed. The emergence of crystal meth marked a dangerous evolution in the methamphetamine story, as the drug shifted from powder and pill forms into a highly purified, crystalline version that could be smoked, producing a faster, more intense, and more addictive high. This transformation began in the late 1970s and early 1980s, when underground producers refined purification methods to create translucent, ice-like crystals, a form that dramatically increased the drug's potency and neurological impact. Smoking crystal meth allowed the substance to reach the brain within seconds, flooding it with dopamine at levels far beyond natural pleasure responses, which reinforced compulsive use and accelerated addiction. Unlike earlier forms, crystal meth created longer binges, severe sleep deprivation, extreme paranoia, and rapid physical deterioration, making its effects more visible and destructive. Users reported heightened confidence, euphoria, and focus at first, followed by crushing crashes, hallucinations, violent behavior, and deep psychological dependence. This new form spread quickly through West Coast cities and parts of Asia, gaining popularity because it was easier to transport, more profitable to sell, and devastatingly effective at creating repeat customers. Crystal meth did not simply increase meth use, it fundamentally changed the scale of addiction, turning a dangerous stimulant into a mass destruction drug that would soon overwhelm communities, healthcare systems, and law enforcement agencies around the world. By the 1980s, crystal meth production and distribution became closely tied to outlaw motorcycle gangs and organized criminal networks, particularly groups like the Hells Angels, who recognized the drug's extreme profitability and growing demand. These organizations established regional distribution routes across the United States, especially in California and the Pacific Northwest, using rural areas to hide small laboratories and avoid law enforcement detection. Meth was relatively cheap to produce, easy to transport, and generated repeat customers due to its intense addictive nature, making it more attractive to criminal groups than drugs like heroin or cocaine. During this period, meth use surged among working-class communities, truck drivers, construction workers, and individuals seeking prolonged energy and confidence, while addiction-related violence, domestic abuse, and crime increased sharply. Makeshift labs created serious dangers, including toxic chemical exposure, explosions, and environmental contamination, turning homes, trailers, and rural properties into hazardous sites. Law enforcement agencies struggled to keep up, as shutting down one lab often led to several more appearing elsewhere, creating a whack-a-mole effect. This era marked the beginning of meth as an entrenched criminal economy where addiction fueled profit, profit fueled expansion, and the drugs reached quietly spread from fringe subcultures into the core of everyday communities, setting the stage for the massive meth epidemic that would dominate the following decades. During the late 1980s and early 1990s, the United States experienced a dramatic methamphetamine boom as crystal meth spread beyond biker gangs and rural networks into suburban neighborhoods, urban centers, and youth culture driven by increased availability, lower prices, and aggressive street-level distribution. West Coast states such as California, Oregon, and Washington became epicenters, while meth rapidly expanded into the Midwest and Southwest, earning nicknames like Poor Man as cocaine because it delivered long-lasting effects at a fraction of the cost. Hospitals and mental health facilities reported rising cases of meth-induced psychosis, violent paranoia, heart failure, and severe addiction, while law enforcement documented sharp increases in property crime, domestic violence, and child neglect linked directly to meth abuse. Media coverage in the early 1990s began portraying meth as a uniquely destructive drug, highlighting images of ruined homes, environmental contamination from illegal labs, and users suffering extreme physical deterioration. Despite growing awareness, government response lagged behind the scale of the crisis, as fragmented enforcement and limited treatment resources failed to slow the drug spread. By the mid-1990s, meth was no longer a hidden problem, but a nationwide epidemic, deeply embedded in communities and economies, signaling that the drug had evolved from a regional threat into a systemic public health and social disaster that would require unprecedented intervention in the years to come. By the mid to late 1990s, methamphetamine production entered a new and far more dangerous phase with the rise of large-scale Superlabs, which were capable of producing massive quantities of crystal meth in a single operation, dramatically increasing supply while lowering street prices. These Superlabs were often hidden in warehouses, remote buildings, or rural properties, and operated by highly organized criminal groups with technical knowledge, security systems, and distribution networks that spanned multiple states. The scale of production overwhelmed local law enforcement, as shutting down one Superlab barely affected availability, and smaller labs continued operating alongside them. Environmental damage became severe, as toxic waste from meth production contaminated soil, water, and homes, with cleanup costs reaching tens of thousands of dollars per site, placing enormous financial strain on governments. At the same time, purity levels increased, making the drug even more addictive and destructive to users' brains and bodies, accelerating psychosis, violence, and long-term cognitive damage. The de-identified meth as one of the most serious drug threats in America by the late 1990s, warning that traditional enforcement strategies were failing. This era proved that meth was no longer a scattered underground drug problem, but an industrialized criminal enterprise capable of adapting, scaling, and surviving pressure. And it marked the moment when the meth epidemic became deeply entrenched in national and international crime systems. By the early 2000s, Mexico emerged as a major player in the global methamphetamine trade, as cartels recognized the enormous profits available from producing and exporting crystal meth to the United States and other countries. Mexican criminal organizations, including the Sinaloa and Juarez cartels, scale labs, chemical importation networks, and sophisticated distribution systems that allowed them to bypass U.S. law enforcement, flood border regions with high-purity meth. These operations were often more efficient than U.S.-based labs because they had access to cheaper precursors, low labor costs, and the ability to conceal production in remote areas or industrial facilities. The rise of Mexican meth also contributed to intense cartel violence as rival groups fought over territory, distribution routes, and access to chemical suppliers, creating a landscape of assassinations, kidnappings, and mass shootings in some regions. American street-level prices dropped while purity increased, creating a surge in addiction rates, hospitalizations, and social disruption, particularly in rural and suburban communities previously untouched by meth abuse. Governments on both sides of the border faced immense challenges in enforcement, chemical control, and prevention, while demand continued to rise, establishing Mexico as the central hub for industrial-scale crystal meth production and setting the stage for a transnational epidemic with global consequences. As methamphetamine production became increasingly industrialized under cartel control, the early 2000s marked a shift where crystal meth was no longer made primarily in small domestic labs, but mass-produced at an international scale, allowing cartels to dominate supply chains and operate with near-corporate efficiency. Mexican organizations refined logistics by sourcing precursor chemicals globally, transporting finished product through established trafficking routes, and distributing meth across North America using existing cocaine and heroin networks. This transformation made meth cheaper. Law enforcement agencies found themselves overwhelmed as arrests and lab seizures failed to disrupt supply, while prisons filled with low-level users and dealers rather than major traffickers. The drug's social impact deepened with rising child welfare cases, workplace accidents, homelessness, and long-term health damage becoming widespread. Meth also began replacing cocaine in many markets due to its lower cost and longer-lasting effects, reshaping the illegal drug economy. By this stage, crystal meth was no longer just a drug problem, but a systemic crisis tied to organized crime, public health collapse, and policy failure, demonstrating how prohibition, demand, profit had combined to create one of the most resilient and destructive drug markets in modern history. As crystal meth spread aggressively in the 2000s, it began to directly compete with cocaine in global drug markets, ultimately overtaking it in many regions because meth was cheaper to produce, easier to transport, longer lasting in effect, and far more profitable for traffickers, while cocaine depended on coca cultivation and complex smuggling routes. Meth could be manufactured year-round using industrial chemicals, giving cartels greater control over supply and pricing. Users who could no longer afford cocaine or wanted longer highs shifted to meth, accelerating its dominance in working class and rural communities. while urban areas saw a rising meth use alongside crack and heroin. Law enforcement agencies observed that meth users committed more property crime and exhibited higher levels of aggression and psychosis compared to cocaine users, increasing the burden on police, courts, and emergency services. Healthcare systems struggled with long-term consequences such as severe dental decay, neurological damage, heart failure, and permanent mental illness, which required far more resources than short-term stimulant treatment. By the late 2000s, meth had effectively reshaped the stimulant market, proving more resilient than cocaine to enforcement pressure and more destructive in its social impact, solidifying its status as the dominant synthetic stimulant driving addiction, crime, and public health crises across multiple continents. As methamphetamine addiction escalated into a national crisis, law enforcement agencies, particularly the D, launched aggressive campaigns in the late 1990s and 2000s to combat production, trafficking, and distribution, framing meth as a top-tier threat alongside heroin and cocaine. Governments introduced precursor chemical regulations, cross-border task forces, harsher sentencing laws, and public awareness campaigns such as Faces of Meth to shock the public into recognizing the drug as devastation. Thousands of small labs were shut down, and billions of dollars were spent on enforcement, incarceration, and cleanup operations. Yet, these efforts often produced unintended consequences, pushing production further into cartel-controlled superlabs outside U.S. borders rather than reducing demand. Prisons filled rapidly with users and low-level dealers, while major traffickers remained largely insulated, highlighting systemic flaws in punitive drug policy. Despite record seizures and arrests, meth availability continued to rise, exposing the limits of enforcement-only strategies. This period revealed a harsh reality: meth could not be eliminated through force alone, and without parallel investment in treatment, prevention, and economic opportunity. The war on meth became another chapter in a broader war on drugs that consumed massive resources while failing to stop addiction-'s spread. As methamphetamine use intensified, media coverage in the late 1990s and 2000s played a powerful role in shaping public perception, transforming meth from a hidden addiction into a symbol of social decay through shocking images, documentaries, and news reports that emphasized extreme physical deterioration, violent behavior, and ruined communities. Campaigns like Faces of Meth displayed before and after mugshots to illustrate rapid aging and damage, while television shows and films dramatized meth labs, addicts, and criminal networks, creating widespread fear and stigma. Although these portrayals successfully raised awareness, they also reinforced stereotypes that portrayed users as irredeemable criminals rather than people suffering from a severe neurological addiction, discouraging many from seeking help. Sensationalism often overshadowed nuanced discussion about poverty, trauma, mental illness, and lack of treatment access that fueled addiction in the first place. Public panic led to political pressure for harsher laws rather than healthcare-based solutions, reinforcing cycles of incarceration and relapse. This era demonstrated how media can both inform and distort reality, shaping policy and public opinion in ways that influence whether society responds to addiction with understanding and rehabilitation or fear and punishment, ultimately affecting the long-term outcomes of the meth crisis itself. The physical and neurological damage caused by crystal meth is among the most severe of any commonly abused drug, because meth directly targets the brain's dopamine system, releasing unnaturally high levels of the chemical that controls pleasure, motivation, and learning, which over time destroys dopamine receptors and leaves users unable to feel normal joy or motivation without the drug. Chronic use leads to profound brain changes, including memory loss, impaired decision-making, emotional instability, and increased risk of Parkinson's-like symptoms, while the body suffers extreme consequences such as rapid weight loss, weakened immune function, heart rhythm disorders, stroke, liver and kidney failure, and severe dental decay, known as meth mouth. Long periods without sleep push users into psychosis, causing hallucinations, paranoia, violent outbursts, and delusions that can persist even after stopping use. Skin damage from obsessive scratching and poor circulation leads to open sores and infections, further accelerating physical decline. Medical research in the 2000s confirmed that some brain damage from meth may partially heal with long-term abstinence, but many effects, especially cognitive and emotional deficits, can last for years or become permanent. This chapter of the meth story revealed that the drug does not simply create addiction, but systematically dismantles the human body and mind, turning a chemical stimulant into a long-term neurological injury with consequences that extend far beyond period of active use. Methamphetamine addiction is not merely a failure of willpower, but a profound psychological and neurological condition that hijacks the brain's reward, stress, and survival systems, making quitting extraordinarily difficult even for those who desperately want to stop. Repeated meth use trains the brain to associate the drug with safety, confidence, control, and relief from emotional pain, while simultaneously weakening the prefrontal cortex, the area responsible for judgment, impulse control, and long-term planning, causing users to prioritize the drug over family, work, and personal safety. Withdrawal from meth does not typically involve the dramatic physical symptoms seen with opioids, but instead produces deep depression, exhaustion, anxiety, anhedonia, and suicidal thoughts, often lasting weeks or months, which drives many users back to the drug simply to feel normal. Trauma, childhood abuse, poverty, social isolation, and untreated mental illness significantly increase vulnerability to addiction, making meth both a cause and a symptom of deeper psychological wounds. Relapse rates remain high, not because treatment fails, but because recovery requires long-term therapy, stable housing, social support, and purpose resources many users lack. This psychological dimension reveals that meth addiction is a chronic brain disorder shaped by environment, biology, and experience, demanding compassion, patience, and comprehensive care rather than punishment if lasting recovery is ever to be achieved. The impact of crystal meth extends far beyond individual users, devastating families and entire communities as addiction erodes trust, stability, and safety, often leaving children to grow up in environments marked by neglect, abuse, and chronic trauma. Parents consumed by meth addiction may disappear for days, exhaust household finances, or expose children to dangerous situations, leading to a surge in foster care placements and long-term psychological harm for young victims. Communities heavily affected by meth experience rising crime rates, abandoned homes, overwhelmed social services, and collapsing local economies, particularly in rural areas where resources are limited. Schools struggle with students facing instability, hunger, and emotional distress, while healthcare systems bear the burden of treating addiction-related injuries, mental illness, and chronic disease. The stigma surrounding meth addiction often isolates families further, preventing them from seeking help and deepening cycles of silence and shame. This widespread social damage reveals that meth is not just an individual problem, but a collective one, capable of destabilizing entire communities and generations, leaving scars that persist long after the drug itself has disappeared from a household or neighborhood. Crystal meth has placed enormous strain on prison systems and criminal justice institutions. As governments responded to rising addiction and crime with harsh sentencing laws that filled jails with users and low-level dealers rather than dismantling the higher structures of organized trafficking. Throughout the 1990s and 2000s, mandatory minimum sentences and zero-tolerance policies led to overcrowded prisons, increased public spending, limited access to rehabilitation, while many incarcerated individuals left prison without treatment, education, or support, only to relapse and reoffend. Prisons themselves became environments where meth addiction, mental illness, and trauma intensified as withdrawal, untreated psychosis, and lack of counseling created cycles of violence and despair. The criminalization-focused approach disproportionately affected poor and marginalized communities, deepening social inequality without significantly reducing meth availability. Studies and policy reviews later revealed that incarceration alone did little to address the root causes of addiction, instead reinforcing a revolving door between the streets, courts, and prisons. This chapter exposed a critical failure in drug policy, showing that punishment without treatment not only failed to stop meth spread, but also expanded its social damage, pushing societies to eventually reconsider whether addiction should be treated primarily as a crime or as a public health crisis. While methamphetamine is often associated with North America, spread across Asia revealed the drug's truly global reach. Crystal meth, commonly known as shabu, yaba, or ice, became widespread in countries such as Thailand, the Philippines, Myanmar, Japan, China, and South Korea from the 1990s onward. Southeast Asia's Golden Triangle region emerged as a major production hub where criminal networks and armed groups exploited weak governance, conflict zones, and porous borders to manufacture and traffic massive quantities of meth across the region. In many Asian countries, meth use expanded rapidly among young people laborers and nightlife scenes due to its low cost, long-lasting effects, and ability to suppress fatigue. While governments responded with some of the world's harshest anti-drug laws, including mandatory death penalties and mass incarceration, despite these extreme measures, meth availability continued to rise, demonstrating once again that enforcement alone could not eliminate demand. Public health systems struggled to cope with addiction, psychosis, and social damage, while fear-based policies often pushed users further underground, away from treatment and support. Asia's meth crisis highlighted the same global pattern seen elsewhere where poverty, stress, migration, and a lack of mental health care created fertile ground for addiction, proving that crystal meth was not a Western problem, but a worldwide epidemic shaped by social conditions as much as criminal networks. Australia became one of the hardest hit developed nations by crystal meth, locally known as ice, during the late 1990s and 2000s. Its geographic isolation failed to protect it from global trafficking networks and instead drove up purity and prices, making meth extremely profitable for criminal organizations. Outlaw motorcycle gangs and transnational syndicates established sophisticated importation routes using shipping containers, air cargo, and postal systems, flooding Australian cities and regional towns with high-grade ice. The drug's intense effects led to sharp increases in addiction. Government reports in the 2010s described ice as one of the most destructive drugs in the country, linking it to long-term unemployment, homelessness, and intergenerational trauma. Despite major investments in policing, border security, and public awareness campaigns, demand remained strong, revealing deep-rooted issues related to stress, isolation, and economic pressure. Australia's experience demonstrated that even wealthy nations with strong institutions are vulnerable to meth epidemics, and that without sustained prevention, mental health care, and rehabilitation, enforcement alone cannot stop the social damage caused by crystal meth. Europe's experience with methamphetamine developed differently from North America and Asia, remaining relatively limited for decades before accelerating in specific regions, particularly Central and Eastern Europe, where economic transition, unemployment, and social disruption after the Cold War created conditions for stimulant abuse. Countries such as the Czech Republic became early centers of meth production and use in the 1990s, where locally produced methadone, referred to as Pervitin, spread within underground networks in neighboring states. Over time, organized crime groups expanded distribution into Germany, Slovakia, Poland, and the Nordic countries, while Western Europe saw growing meth use among certain subcultures, including nightlife scenes and men who have sex with men, where the drug was linked to prolonged partying and risky behavior. European health systems reported rising cases of addiction, psychosis, and infectious diseases linked to meth use, though harm reduction approaches in some countries helped limit broader societal damage compared to more punitive models elsewhere. Nonetheless, the increasing involvement of international trafficking networks and rising purity levels signaled that Europe was not immune to the global meth trade. This chapter illustrated how meth adapts to local conditions, exploiting social and economic vulnerabilities while challenging governments to balance enforcement, prevention, and public health in a rapidly changing drug landscape. The digital age transformed the methamphetamine trade by moving large portions of communication, marketing, and distribution online, making drugs more accessible while reducing face-to-face risk for dealers and buyers. Encrypted messaging apps, social media platforms, and dark web marketplaces allowed traffickers to advertise crystal meth discreetly, coordinate logistics, accept digital payments, and ship drugs through postal and courier systems that were never designed to detect narcotics at scale. This shift to centralized street dealing, enabling small networks and even individual sellers to reach wide audiences without traditional criminal hierarchies, while also making law enforcement surveillance far more complex. Users, especially younger generations, encountered meth through online communities where drug use was normalized. Risks were downplayed, and addiction was rarely discussed honestly. The anonymity of the internet accelerated impulsive purchasing and relapse, as access required only a few clicks rather than physical contact. Governments and tech companies struggled to respond, constantly chasing evolving platforms and encryption methods. This chapter revealed how technology, originally meant to connect and empower people, unintentionally became a powerful amplifier for addiction and illegal trade, allowing crystal meth to spread faster, quieter, and more efficiently than ever before in human history. As governments gradually recognized the limits of punishment-focused drug policies, the late 2000s and 2010s marked a slow but significant shift toward treatment, prevention, and harm reduction approaches in response to the meth crisis. Public health experts emphasized evidence-based therapies such as cognitive behavioral therapy, contingency management, long-term residential rehabilitation, and community-based recovery programs to address the deep psychological roots of addiction. Although no single medication could cure meth dependence, integrated treatment, combining mental health care, addiction counseling, employment support, and stable housing showed the strongest long-term outcomes. Prevention efforts increasingly targeted early intervention, education, and trauma-informed care, especially among youth and high-risk populations. Some countries expanded needle exchange programs, supervised health services, and outreach initiatives to reduce overdose deaths, disease transmission, and social isolation, despite political resistance. This shift represented a fundamental change in understanding and acknowledging acid addiction as a chronic health condition rather than a moral failure, and, while progress remained uneven and underfunded, it offered the first realistic path toward reducing harm, supporting recovery, and breaking the endless cycle of relapse, incarceration, caused by crystal meth. Scientific research in the 2010s and early 2020s intensified efforts to better understand methamphetamine addiction at the neurological and genetic level, revealing how long-term meth use physically rewires brain circuits related to reward, stress, memory, and self-control, making relapse a biological risk rather than a simple choice. Advanced brain imaging studies showed reduced gray matter volume and disrupted dopamine signaling in chronic users, while genetic research suggested that some individuals may be more vulnerable to stimulant addiction due to inherited traits affecting impulse control and stress response. Researchers explored experimental treatments, including neurostimulation, mindfulness-based relapse prevention, and medications originally developed for depression or ADHD to reduce cravings and improve recovery outcomes. At the same time, trauma-informed care gained prominence, recognizing that untreated PTSD, anxiety, and depression significantly increase relapse risk if not addressed alongside addiction. Although breakthroughs remained gradual rather than revolutionary, this growing body of research shifted the narrative from blame to biology, reinforcing the idea that effective solutions must be rooted in science, long-term support, and individualized care rather than short-term punishment or simplistic, just to say no messaging. Despite decades of damage, recovery from crystal meth addiction is possible. Thousands of long-term survivors demonstrate that the brain and body can partially heal when given time, stability, and sustained support. Former users often describe recovery as a slow, rebuilding process rather than a single turning point, requiring months or years of therapy, relapse prevention, lifestyle restructuring, and reconnection with purpose through work, family, or creative meaning. Brain studies show gradual restoration of dopamine function after prolonged abstinence, improving mood, focus, and emotional regulation, though cravings may resurface under stress even after long periods of sobriety. Peer support networks, faith-based groups, and community recovery programs play a critical role in maintaining motivation and reducing isolation, while employment and housing stability dramatically lower relapse risk. However, stigma remains one of the greatest barriers to recovery, as former meth users face discrimination that limits opportunities and reinforces shame. This chapter underscores a vital truth often ignored in discussions about meth, that recovery is not only possible, but common when society chooses support over judgment, proving that even after extreme addiction, human resilience can outlast chemical destruction. Looking toward the future, the global response to crystal methamphetamine faces a defining crossroads. As societies must decide whether to repeat past failures or build systems grounded in science, compassion, and long-term prevention, experts increasingly warn that without addressing root causes such as economic inequality, unemployment, untreated mental illness, social isolation, and childhood trauma, meth and other synthetic drugs will continue to evolve faster than laws and enforcement strategies. The rise of new synthetic stimulants and chemically modified meth variants presents additional challenges, as manufacturers constantly adapt formulas to evade regulation, making early detection and rapid policy response critical. Future solutions emphasize integrated approaches combining education, mental health services, addiction treatment, housing security, and community rebuilding rather than fragmented interventions. Technology, once a driver of drug distribution, may also become part of the solution through digital recovery tools, telehealth counseling, and data-driven early warning systems. This final chapter suggests that the fight against meth is not a battle that can be won in the traditional sense, but a long-term effort to reduce harm, strengthen resilience, and create societies where fewer people feel the need to escape reality through chemical dependence. The story of crystal methamphetamine is ultimately a mirror reflecting society's deepest fractures, revealing how chemistry, economics, trauma, care, and policy collide to shape human lives. As a drug once developed for medical and military purposes, evolved into one of the most destructive substances of the modern era. Across decades and continents, meth has followed the same pattern, emerging where despair, pressure, and disconnection exist, thriving where treatment is scarce and punishment replaces care. History shows that enforcement alone cannot erase addiction, Media fear cannot heal trauma, and stigma cannot rebuild broken brains or families. Yet this story is not only one of destruction, because within it exists countless examples of survival, recovery, and transformation, proving that when science, passion, and community align, even the most severe addiction can be overcome. The future of the meth crisis will depend not on harsher laws or stronger borders, but on whether societies choose to invest in mental health, economic stability, education, and human dignity. In the end, crystal meth is not just a drug problem, it is a human problem, and only human-centered solutions can prevent the next generation from repeating the same cycle of chemical escape and social collapse.